what could happen if we scaled the things that we already see happening around the world and things that we already see that are working. And so for me, this is like a hope building perspective, or like a hope building approach, because it's not just like out in space, like, oh, this is what you should do in order to do XYZ. It's like, no, this is happening all over the world, and all we have to do is do more of it.
This is Evolve CPG, a community of purpose-driven brand leaders who not only believe in better, but actively pursue it. That's better products, better brands, and better leadership for a better world. Join our online community where we're going further, faster, together at community.evolvecpg.com. I'm your host, Gage Mitchell, founder and creative director of Modern Species, a sustainable brand design agency helping better brands grow and scale their impact. On today's episode, we're speaking with Breyn Hibbs, head of social and environmental impact at Take-Two, about the complexities of calculating and communicating positive impact.
Hi, everybody. My name is Breyn Hibbs, and I'm the head of social and environmental impact for Take-Two. We are an upcycled food company, and specifically we make barley milk out of the spent grain from beer brewing. So on a mission to upcycle as much spent grain as possible and turn it into nourishing, delicious, and sustainable food for people like you all who are out there listening.
Yeah, indeed. Like, who doesn't love the sound of barley milk? I mean, I love like malted milkshakes, which is, malt comes from barley. So the idea of just skipping the middleman and just going straight to barley milk, that sounds amazing to me. So I'm personally, I'm keeping an eye out for the product on shelves, and I'm excited to try it. Or maybe I'll just try it at Expo here in a couple weeks. So anyway, with that, thanks for coming on the show. I'm excited to talk to you more and geek out on a bunch of things like sustainability and measurement and all that kind of stuff. But before we go there, I was just curious about your background a little bit, because a lot of the people I've had on the show in the past that are working in sustainability roles often came from like a sustainability background or economics background or environmental management background. But I noticed your background was more in social change. So can you tell us a little bit more about that background, how you got started in that work, and then how that journey landed you with Take-Two?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think as with, many people in different kinds of fields, it's not like I had a linear path, as you're saying. And I think that's true for a lot of people. And
for sure, yeah.
Especially for, I'm not a millennial, I'm older than that, but especially for millennials, I think, and younger generations, there's really this sense of people wanting to explore multiple kinds of things and maybe ending up in a job or a career that isn't directly related to what they studied. And I don't know about you, but my interests now in life are very different than they were when I was 18, making a decision to like go to a particular school or study a particular thing. And so when, to kind of link it back to that social change piece, I started studying philosophy and religion as my major in school.
Oh, cool.
But what I was minoring in and what I got really excited about was leadership studies. And at that time, it was really through the lens of doing social justice work. And I got really passionate about the women's movement and feminism. And was really involved in the kind of women's center on campus at that time. And that really led me to, the first 10 years of my career was in social change work through the lens of education with adult people in general and with women in particular. And one story I just like to share and tell that's a huge part of my path and a huge part of my journey was, I worked for this women's leadership and empowerment nonprofit that was based in San Diego, and we had an education-based mission. And one of the things that one arm of our organization is we offered these amazing like health and wellness and financial literacy and, herbalism and food and local food movement related classes to women who were in recovery, so who were healing, who were going through major transformation in their life, who wanted and needed support in a lot of very kind of, explicit ways. But we offered those same classes to women in super high powered jobs in San Diego. So CEOs, executive directors of
Oh,
nonprofits. And then we
interesting.
also ran similar classes and workshops for the teams of different corporations and organizations. And what I love, and sort of the point of all of what I'm sharing, is that the same classes worked equally as well and were as equally intriguing to quote both groups or all of the groups of women and people that we were working with. And so, just a lesson in like for me at that time and continually, which is like we're all really searching for how to live meaningful lives. What is the way that we, inside of ourselves and for our families and our communities, like how can we be healthy? How do we access healthy food? What truly is the path to whether you call it, awakening or personal development or spiritual development, like what does that look like individually and in community? So that's kind of how I was, or what I was doing then. And then what I love now is everything that I learned, although it might not look like it's directly related, feels like I'm just getting to do it on a bit of a macro level. So instead of working with individuals on a daily basis, I'm really taking a lot of these both concepts and practices that relate to social change, kind of taking them, blowing them up to this macro level, and then asking like, how do we create inside of the CPG world, inside of the food system, behavior change at the level of not just individual people, but families, communities, entire companies, and then, a segment of the food system potentially. And it's the same theory and some of the same practices. It just is like being applied slightly differently.
I love that because part of my reason for this Evolve CPG podcast and online community is the thinking that if we can fix the CPG industry by making sure 100% of products you find in CPG are better for the world, better for health, more equitable, more environmentally conscious, etc. If we can do that, we would solve most of the world's problems. Like when you look at the book Drawdown. Sorry, my cat's walking back and forth on the desk. When you look at the book Drawdowns, a lot. I think it was like I can't remember now the number, but let's just say like 7 out of the top 10 climate change problems were all food related, and then add to that just the infrastructure and shipping and like all these other kind of things that go along with CPGs, and the fact that a lot of people like change their whole life based around like the moment they're in life and the food they're eating and so on and so forth. So if it just feels like a linchpin kind of thing. So exactly what you're saying, like by taking a macro view of, sure, it seems like we're just helping some brands grow their impact, but by doing that, I think we'd change the entire world, both from a health standpoint, from a mental health and a physical health standpoint, from an economic standpoint, from a climate change it just impacts everything.
Yeah, totally. Yes, I love that so much. And what I'm sure you're seeing, and then what I see in the, partner brands that we work with, and even just like the brands that I myself am out in the world purchasing and supporting because of my values and the way that I'm aligning, what I'm seeing more and more of. And I think, yeah, again, to repeat myself, what you're probably seeing is these brands that have impact or purpose related missions, who are doing this kind of work, whether it's explicitly around sustainability or the environmental movement, or it's around something, a social related or human or equity related thing, that those two things are so tied together that a lot of the companies are really, it's like if you're doing one, you have to do the other. Like there's kind of this movement where it's like you can't just do one anymore. It seems very
Yeah, yeah,
obvious, and I know I also want to recognize that we haven't made it yet. Like we're not all doing enough
for
yet
sure.
because those gaps haven't fully been filled and answered, and equity and justice are not here yet. But more and more with B Corporation certification as an example, and lots of other things that companies are doing, it's like, yeah, we take care of our people. We source as much as we can and as best we can from suppliers who are taking care of their people, who have fair and just and equitable labor practices, and we're making this product that's good or better for the planet. And I think, again, tying all of those together is so necessary as we move forward.
Absolutely. That's part of why I wanted to dig into your background a little bit, is because I think a lot of people confuse sustainability with just environmental concerns. But of course, exactly to your point, it needs to also take into consideration economic impact and social impact, because if you don't, then it's like a three-legged stool with one leg. That's not going to stand up very well, right? And all those things are so interconnected too. Like climate change and environment is a social problem, or does have social impacts, and the economy obviously is tied to social impact as well. So I think you're right that I think companies maybe started with one little piece of that puzzle, but now it's becoming more standard for to have a actual three-legged stool where people are considering social, economic, and environmental impact, which is great.
Yes, yes.
That's great to know some of that background and some of your passion there. But how did you end up with Take Two? How did you end up joining that team?
Yeah. Well, I was working in a job here in Central Oregon doing work with folks in recovery, and had an opportunity to become the field marketing manager basically for Take Two, which is hilarious and awesome because that was February of 2020. So I basically spent a month outlining like the whole field marketing strategy for the launch of Take Two, which was going to be in March of 2020. Umpteen demos, umpteen markets, umpteen events, just like really laying out like our whole sales strategy was, and our whole launch strategy was tied to like all of these in-person events and activations. And then of course, as you know, COVID hit, everyone went into lockdown and shelter in place. And so I just feel really actually super grateful that Take Two didn't just sort of let me go immediately. It was like my job description was completely moot at that point. So, I spent the first several months, we all actually, as a part of the Take Two team, spent the first couple months really wearing just a lot of hats. So I've, worked in the warehouse and fulfilled orders and shipped them via FedEx. Initially, before we had any distributors on board, we were as many startups do, hand delivering everything. So driving back and forth between Seattle, Eugene, all over Portland, with like delivering barley milk out of the back of my car. Helped with, marketing at that time, helped with selling into retail partners. And then eventually some of the impact stuff really came about as from a culture perspective as well as a marketing perspective. And so as we did that work internally, it just sort of very naturally more and more kept, falling onto my plate. And then, I became even more passionate about it. And then sort of, I guess the rest is history. Yeah. But that's how I sort of moved into full-time doing our impact and our certification related and our B Corp related
That
work.
Explains how you have such a long title: Head of Sustainability, Impact, and Community Partnerships. I'm not sure how that fits on a business card, but yeah, that makes sense. And again, it's all kind of interconnected, right? So I think more companies should be taking that holistic view, and maybe at some point there will be enough knowledge about that holism, I guess, around impact that you could just be the head of impact and drop all the other words, and people will know that means community and sustainability as well. All right. Yes, so totally. I know when you and I first connected, you were telling me a little bit about Take Two's kind of founding story, like how the product itself got created. Can you just do like a super brief overview of how the product got developed, but then maybe a little bit more info on the greater mission of Take Two?
Yes. Yeah, I love sharing our founder story and our origin story. So Jarek and Matt, who are the co-founders of Take Two, they both actually worked for Anheuser-Busch InBev, and they were on a team there that was specifically recruited to figure out the problem of spent grain. So historically, spent grain, it comes out of the beer brewing process, and it has essentially, for all of the decades of beer making, has essentially been deemed waste and or just simply a byproduct. But interestingly, what is used in the beer making process is the sugars or the carbohydrates. And so what is left over is actually the most nutrient rich part of the grain, which is its highly concentrated fiber and protein. So Matt and Jarek, very different backgrounds. Jarek has been in sustainable food for over a decade, started, multiple food companies, healthy, sustainable food companies. And then Matt had a background in engineering and had gone to business school, and then, is like a food scientist as well. So they were a part of this larger team of like, these great minds that were set to the task of what do we do? How do we take the spent grain and save it relatively quickly, because it's highly perishable. So something has to be done with it very quickly in order for it to be human safe, or to have the possibility of being turned into human food. So how do we save it? What do we do with it, of all? And then they were a part of the team that helped figure that out, which is a whole story in and of itself. And then, the outcome of that initial question was highly concentrated barley protein powder and barley fiber powder. And so then there was a question that another smaller group of people took on of what are the application possibilities for one or more of these basically ingredients. And so the first initial round that they worked on from, again, inside of AB InBev was actually a protein and fiber shake, like a single serve fiber protein shake that did actually really amazing. It was super nourishing, tasted really well. People actually really loved it. It was pretty successful. Jarek and Matt both went back kind of to the drawing board from the perspective of impact. And I think this is where our story is so wonderful, is they said, there's no way that enough people are going to drink single serve protein and fiber shakes that are priced pretty high. Like, it was a premium product. There's no way that we can save enough spent grain with this single serve product that's only reaching a very small group of people. And so they basically repitched this idea of a barley milk, because the opportunity of plant-based milks to make it into a lot of homes, specifically in our country for right now, but in America, everybody drinks milk and or plant-based milk. Everybody uses some form of dairy. And two, this question around, displacing dairy is, a huge question for many and all kind of plant-based focused or plant-rich focused people and companies. And so they basically pitched this idea of like, this would have way more impact if we could get people to use milk, plant-based milk, barley milk, on a daily basis in their kitchen, in their coffee, in all of their recipes, drinking it by the glass. It's going to save way more spent grain and therefore divert way more food waste than a handful of people drinking these single-serve fiber and protein shakes. So that's the point at which Take Two was spun out. We are our own independent company at this point, and launched barley milk under that premise, under that impact-related premise of saving as much, being a part of the solution of saving as much spent grain as possible.
Is that where the Take Two name came from? Is that where the Take Two name came from as well? Is because it was like their second idea for the use of the barley?
Yeah, it has kind of multiple meanings, because we give a second life to spent grain, and it's like literally the second go at a product using the spent grain out of that particular kind of think tank that started about 5 or 6 years ago. So it's been a long journey, even though Take Two itself as a company, we're only 2 years old, but our roots go further back.
That's interesting. And why was Anheuser willing to let this brilliant product idea go? Were they just saying, yeah, that sounds great, but we're not really interested in launching a whole new kind of product category or something?
Yeah. Well, there's a few things to say about that. One is, at the time and now, Anheuser-Busch was in its own journey of figuring out how to create an arm of their company that specifically is committed to the upcycling mission, and that exists now. It's called Evergrain. And so there is an upcycled sustainable ingredient company that also spun out of Anheuser-Busch a little bit after Take Two. And that's where we source our barley protein from. They're our ingredient partners. And then also our investors are Evergrain. So we are still connected in with the network and the body of Anheuser-Busch, which some people know and some people don't know. And we're totally transparent, because some people like that about us and other people don't like that about us. But the beautiful thing, and I think this is really the if there's anything that we can be super excited and so proud about, is that small breweries at this point don't have the financial or the person or the people or the resources to upcycle their spent grain in this way. Unfortunately. And so if you're an investor sitting here listening,
Yeah.
like take some of your money and like go help one or more local breweries get the technology and build the, facility basically to be able to upcycle their spent grain, because this is
Yeah.
incredible. This is an incredible food waste solution. So regardless of sort of our, you know, the ownership structure of our investors, there's only two companies that we know of in the U.S. that are upcycling spent grain on a large scale, and that's Evergrain and another amazing company that I'll shout the name of all day, which is called Regrained. And I
Yeah.
know you know them
I was
as
actually going to
well.
ask if there was any overlap there, because I don't know what the timeline was of Anheuser doing their studies versus Dan at Regrained kind of figuring out his process. But was there kind of overlap? Was there a little collaboration going on there, or was it just kind of like serendipitous that both you and Regrained ended up coming up with the same idea at the same time?
I'm not going to be able to speak super wisely about the timeline of things. I'm not going to be able to speak wisely about the timeline. What I know is that, and you can probably say more about this than I can, Dan, and the Regrained folks, they were originally, you know, focused on CPG offerings
Yeah,
and
for sure.
products, and they pivoted at some point, which again I don't know the exact details or timeline of. They pivoted at some point and said, no, actually the most important thing we can do is figure out how to, upcycle this spent grain. Like the products will come, or like they can be what they, but we have to like systematize this process of saving
Yeah.
grain. So now, and again, please add, but they have an amazing facility in the Bay Area where this is what they do, and they got funding from the, help me, U.S. Department of Agriculture, I think, to
Yeah.
take on this amazing project.
Yeah, and I think it was similar reasoning too to kind of what you're talking about. Is sure they could sell one or two products or whatever that they can manage as a small company, and make a certain amount of impact, or they could switch to more of an ingredient and innovation platform and help a lot of people weave more of this upcycled product into their specific CPG products. And they've just got so many amazing partnerships going on with whether it's bakeries or ice cream companies or grocery store chains or whatever else to create these new and interesting products. So it's pretty fun. We'll put links to all these kind of different things in the show notes if anyone's curious to hear more. But I was just wondering what that overlap might be. Super cool to hear.
Yeah, and it makes me. I did a shout out to investors of like, go invest in like an upcycled project. But also, if you're a food entrepreneur who's listening, a food maker, a food entrepreneur, like, and you're thinking of making, whether it's cookies or bread or granola bars or whatever it is you might be thinking about making, consider the option of using an upcycled flour, an upcycled protein, an upcycled fiber, because in a lot of cases, not every single case, but in a lot of cases, it's essentially a one-to-one replacement for whatever else you would be using, and it's an incredible opportunity to reduce food waste and create incredible
Yeah,
impact.
good note. So for anyone interested in that, probably check out the Upcycled Food Association, and on that website you can look for upcycled ingredients, or just contact one of the upcycled certified brands or a member and see if they're kind of selling ingredients, because I know that a lot of the upcycled food companies are heading in that direction as well. Sure, they've got their own products, but they're also building out infrastructure to create a lot of these ingredients for other companies. So that's a great note. So now let's pivot a little bit into like this idea of like upcycling and impact and all the different, its effect on climate change and food waste and, water savings and all these kind of things that upcycled brands like Take Two can claim. I'm curious to know, like, we work with a handful of different upcycled food brands as well as the Upcycled Food Association. So it's seeing like everyone kind of approaching it a little bit differently in terms of how they're measuring and assessing their impact. But what's Take Two's philosophy or strategy for kind of measuring and communicating, or let's focus on assessing the impact.
Yeah, yes. This has been such a journey for us, both because I think there's a lot to navigate in this space in general, um, making decisions about how companies assess their impacts, and then the second part would be how do we communicate our impacts. And then just from kind of my seat, because I don't hold a super technical background, like I'm not the one that's running the numbers on the back end around CO2 emissions. I don't know how to do that yet, although maybe someday I will know more of that. So from my seat, it's really finding and aligning with the partners who can support us in doing that. So I can share a little bit of like what we've done so far, some of our learnings, because not everything has been super like streamlined. Like we've had hiccups and then had to go back to the drawing board, and then also kind of share about where we're heading. One thing that you brought up earlier, which is so important, is Project Drawdown, and we'll put the notes, or as Gage said, this can be in the notes, but drawdown.org. I want to start there, which has nothing to do with Take Two initially. So, but to just start from kind of this contextual place, which is Project Drawdown. What they did, which is so amazing, is instead of just making up a whole bunch of, I'm going to kind of like butcher this probably. No, but instead of making up a whole bunch of solutions that people and or companies and or entire nations could do from scratch in order to address the climate situation, they went out into the world and they studied all of the climate change solutions and related sustainability solutions that are happening all over the globe. Things that are already working that small grassroots communities are doing, all the way up to like entire towns, entire cities, and then in some cases like entire nations having certain approaches. They took what's already happening and they have done all kinds of amazing data, math, algorithms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they said, what could happen if we scaled the things that we already see happening around the world and things that we already see that are working? And so for me, this is like a hope building perspective, or like a hope building approach, because it's not just like out in space, like, oh, this is what you should do in order to do X, Y, Z. It's like, no, this is happening all over the world, and all we have to do is do more of it. And so in the process of looking at all of those solutions, they basically took the top 100, I think. They took the top 100 solutions, they scaled them, and then they have ranked them in order of impact. And there's a couple different scenarios. Like if you go to their website, you can see a scenario for staying at 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in our temperature as a planet. And then they run a scenario that's like, if we actually, take it to the very, very like last turning point and go all the way to the 2 degrees. But if you run those scenarios, what is true is that like the top the top third and fourth most impactful solutions for addressing climate change are reducing food waste and eating a plant-rich diet. And that's important and impactful because both of those things are things that every single individual can do every day in our lives. So it's not depending on companies, governments, et cetera, to do things for us. Of course that has to happen too. There's huge responsibility from a corporate perspective, a national perspective. But really, as individuals, every day we can make choices around reducing our food waste and eating more plants. That has a tremendous impact. Okay, so all of that said, Take Two lives at the intersection of those two things. We do both of those things. We reduce food waste through upcycling, and because we're a plant-based vegan option, we're also displacing some animal products at the grocery store shelf. That's kind of my context, because some of our measurements and some of the things that we're interested in assessing in the future relate to both of those things, reducing waste and then, basically plant-based or low-carbon protein solutions, which is what upcycled barley protein is. What we've done so far, actually, I'll pause there. Do you want to add anything, Gage? I know you have a lot of your own love for all of this stuff and wisdom.
I've got some stuff to add, but I want to see where you're going first, because I want to see, okay, like for example, where my mind is going, I guess I'll just ask it is, so that food waste part, like That's one thing. You can break that down, like the benefits or impact of reducing food waste, in so many different ways, right? It can be in reducing the amount of land that needs to be converted from forest into agricultural land because we can make better use of the existing land we have. You can talk about the water inputs or the chemical inputs or whatever it takes to grow more product, if we weren't kind of making the best use of all that product. And then there's also like what happens to that product if we're not using it. Like an example with cacao and coffee, like both of those beans come packed in a pod that has a bunch of fruit wrapped around it, that normally that fruit's just tossed out, right? So like, and it's not just like, oh, oopsie, we didn't use it. Like when those industries are so big that if you just throw a bunch of that fruit on the land and let it ferment and rot and whatever else, it's going to start leaching a bunch of stuff into the earth, which at large quantities like that is not good, right? So there's kind of the reducing some of those impacts, and then you could kind of go on and on and on from there. So I guess I'm excited to hear how you're personally approaching like how do you even quantify the impact of that food waste, because there's so many different ways that you could do it. Are you trying to say them all, or are you just picking one, or are you leaning on like what consumers are most interested in, or the thing that you can actually get the best data for, or what? So please continue, and then I'll ask more questions.
Yeah, those are all important things as well, and maybe we'll return to some of those very explicitly. So we've taken an approach of, there's kind of three different ways that we are thinking about this as a company. So one is there's the level of the impact that we're having simply by using spent grain. So it's in some ways, it's a very, that one's one of our simplest ways of assessing a couple of things. And the way that we do that one is we actually use the Refed Insights calculator. So there's a website. We'll also put this in the notes, Refed's Insight Engine, and then they have an impact calculator. And what that does is it looks at specifically reducing food waste. So if you find a different solution for food that would have otherwise gone to landfills, been incinerated, would have gone to feed animals, even would have ended up in like a compost pile. It's a very, very incredible tool that they've built out. It's very smart. It has a lot of options. So for example, for us, we know that about 80% of the spent grain that we save, that we use, would have gone to feed animals, and about 20% of it would have ended up in landfills. So the tool has enough options to where we can actually put that level of data in there. So we can say we're saving, out of XYZ pounds of spent grain that we've saved, for example, this 80% from animals and 20% from landfills, and then it gives us some impact metrics, which I'll say more about. So we've taken the approach of looking at what are our impacts simply from using upcycled barley, aka barley not from the farm. And the metrics that we're using for that are specifically carbon emissions diverted, water saved, because that's what the tool gives us, and we rely on that tool for that specific calculation. And then we convert that into the one more thing, which is really cool, which is the amount of protein, essentially the equivalent amount of protein in a certain number of meals. So the FDA says that 50 grams of protein per day is about what we should be eating. And so we convert the amount of barley protein into a protein calculation that says something like we've saved enough protein, not entire meals worth, like we're not saving entire meals with our barley milk. We know that people can't replace entire meals with our barley milk, but we know that people could replace protein in their diet with our barley milk. So the amount of protein in 100,000 meals, let's say, that's what we've saved by using upcycled barley. So that's kind of one arm of what we have done and are doing. There's another category, which is our product level metrics and assessment. And this is the one that people are most familiar with, I think, at this point, because when companies do something like a carbon footprint on pack, what it's measuring is the carbon footprint of everything that went into making that container of blah, blah, blah. So that container of barley milk, that container of oat milk, that, container of chips. And there's multiple metrics that are possible at that level. So you can look at some of which you've already named. You can look at the carbon emissions of making that product. You can look at water usage. You can look at land usage, and you can look at energy usage. And sometimes energy and carbon emissions are combined depending on what tool you're using, what assessment you're using, what standards you're using. And that is a place where I can tell you Take-Two's journey so far with that at a product level assessment. So early on, when we were still like a really, really new startup, and we didn't have the ability yet to do a full life cycle analysis, or LCA, which are obviously that's a major buzzword because it's the primary, kind of gold standard for an impact assessment. When we didn't have the ability to do that, we partnered with the BARD MBA students in sustainability. They put out a call to companies every year to take on projects, and we got chosen. And so they did a carbon accounting project for us. And so we looked at our, one carton, one bottle of our barley milk from cradle, aka sourcing all of our ingredients, supplies, transportation, through our manufacturing process, and all the way to our, distributors. And we have our carbon footprint basically for that. We haven't done a full analysis yet of our water or our land or our energy, but that's on the horizon for us for a product level assessment. And then and we can go into more of all of these, but the third kind of level, or how we're thinking about it inside of Take-Two, would then be company level assessments. So for example, looking at the carbon footprint of our entire company, all of our activities, everything that we do, including we're primarily a remote team. So there's ways that all of that now is being calculated as the company claiming part of individual people's daily home use of stuff.
Yeah.
And impacts inside of what we would claim for our company. And that's also on the horizon for us. And that's where we see, companies that are making their carbon neutral and or carbon negative commitments, where they're saying sometime in the next X number of years, not just our product, but our entire company is going to go either carbon neutral or carbon negative. And so those are the three ways we're thinking about it: the ingredient level, our product level, and then our company level. And we have room for growth in all of them.
I love that. I'm a framework nerd, so being able to break it up in clear categories of ingredient, product, and company is a great way to look at it. And I'll happily say that too, Modern Species, who's kind of the agency behind this Evolve CPG thing and all that, we just got our climate neutral certification as well passed. Now, granted, we don't make a physical product, so it's easier to calculate and easier to achieve, but it's nice to be able to have that stamp, because now we're B Corp certified, 1% for the planet member, and carbon neutral, which is the trifecta, triple crown or something. And hopefully there will be some other certification for equitable or whatever, but I guess B Corp kind of is. But anyway,
Totally.
so
Wow,
yeah,
that's amazing. Congratulations on that. That is
thank you.
so
Yeah, it's exciting. It's been something we've been working towards those things for a while, and it's nice to finally have that achieved. So I had there's so much that you just talked about. A couple couple of the questions that I remembered to take a note on so that I can ask you was, in that kind of analysis of the product, or maybe it was in the ingredient, did you compare that analysis to other ingredients? For example, my Modern Species did some work with So Delicious a while back on kind of their sustainability reports, and I remember in there we had a chart that showed the sustainability or the carbon footprint or the water use or something like that. I can't remember. It's been a while now. But of coconuts versus, let's say, dairy versus almonds or, other kind of thing, alternatives to drinking their coconut milk. And it was interesting to see how different those numbers were, vastly, vastly different, right? So I'd also be curious. I know there's this big growing plant-based milk kind of movement right now, and there's all these different sources of it. Oatly's kind of making a big splash for oat milk, and there's like I mentioned, So Delicious has been on like the almond and coconut and soy and other kind of paths for a long time. And now we finally have this awesome idea of barley as well, which I don't think I historically have seen that used for dairy alternative in the past. So I don't know how that compares to other types of plant milk. But were you able to analyze, and I guess this would be on the ingredient level, but it could also be product level. Were you able to analyze how much better or comparative like barley milk is to something like oat milk, for example?
Mm, yes, all of the above in certain ways. So, Evergrain has done a full LCA comparing barley protein to soy protein, pea protein, and whey protein. So that level of analysis exists prior to us existing, like prior to Take Two. That's just something that they've taken on. One of the interesting questions there, which I think is, a legitimate question, and one of the questions that they were, and I think are continuing to answer is, well, if you feed spent grain to cows, usually, let's say, livestock in general, that means if you now take away the food source and you turn the spent grain into food for humans, what are you going to feed the cows? And maybe there's a terrible impact because of whatever you choose to feed the cows, where it actually like is worse or just as bad, for example. And so Evergrain is taking on like that level because they're making the ingredient itself of the barley protein. They're taking on that level of analysis and have run a few different scenarios that kind of show that like even if you have to choose another grain to feed the cows, it still is good and better to use the spent grain to feed humans, or to turn the spent grain into barley protein and barley fiber. So that LCA, I believe, is like published and public and available because it was done by like a third-party consulting firm. On our end, what we did in this project with the BARD students is it was more of an internal analysis. So this is just, and for those of you out there who are listening, who are like deeply in this field, you probably know this. So the work that we did with the BARD students, we really used as internal frameworks for helping clean up our supply chain and make like a decision-making kind of tools. We haven't yet been able to publish some of what we found with the BARD students because we need to go through a third-party certification for that. So that's part of what we're in the midst of, and we're working with, we're going to be working with Planet Forward, which is another link we can put in the notes, but Planet Forward in order to do like our more full LCA and then be able to sort of publicly share our impacts. This is where it's been like a multi-step process for us, which is like when we first started engaging with the BARD students, we didn't know we weren't going to be able to publish everything that they gave to us as deliverables. But that quickly became a part of the conversation is like, hey, this is more of, an internal thing. So what they did for us was they looked at the ingredients of our milk in kind of multiple ways, where we were actually looking at the hot spots in our supply chain. So this isn't answering directly your question, Gage, but I'm getting to it. But we did get to see like the impacts, for example, of sugar and cacao. Those are definitely the two sort of most, from all of the ingredients in our milk, and it might be really sort of obvious if we think about those two industries, but those are the two kind of places where we were like, okay, like what can we do? How can we source differently? Like what are the either more sustainable and or are there regenerative options? Things like that. Nice. So we're still in the midst of kind of answering some of those things. And then the BARD students also did a comparative analysis with some of our competitors. And because we didn't go through that, we haven't been through that third-party assessment, I won't name any of them by name. But essentially the takeaway is that our carbon footprint is among the lowest for sure, if we are to compare it, for example, like original barley milk to some original other plant-based milks, even our chocolate, which has sugar and cacao in it, so it has a higher carbon footprint, for example, it still is lower than other plant-based chocolate options. So we do have some of those comparisons, nice. And we just, we know them we know them inside. And we're sort of leaning into, or we'll be leaning into, how to share those, not by like calling out explicit brands all the time, but just to really share it's really the impact of upcycling is what it really boils down to. It really boils down to not taking a nut, a seed, or a grain from a farm and instead using something that has already gone through one life cycle and using it again.
That's great. I'm excited to see those results as well, just because as we're demonstrating, there's so many different ways you could approach kind of looking at the impact, and the more you dig into it, the more you need to kind of understand about the entire system, right? Like, I liked the point that you brought up about like, well, if this isn't going to go feed that cow or that pig anymore, what is going to feed that cow or that pig, and what's the impact of that? So it's like that unintended consequences of your, choices that you're making to try to make an impact, but sometimes those can result in a negative impact somewhere else in the supply chain. But actually, just out of curiosity, I don't know if you know this, but do you know like what they're feeding the cows or the pigs or whatever that used to be eating this barley when it is diverted? Do you know how they're filling that in? Is there known information, like they're just saying like, oh, we'll just give them fresh barley, or we'll just use corn or something else like that? Is that a known thing?
I don't know. I feel like it's something I could potentially find out bits and pieces of research on. I mean, part of me wants to say like, let's just stop the industrial farming of animals. So that we don't have to feed them all of these things.
That's certainly one way to look at it.
But I also think that the barley, that specifically the spent grain that we're getting, I don't know, let's say there's like some radius, right, of like the farms and some amount of radius are getting some of this spent grain. And so I'm curious if like potentially, different farmers, depending on the region that they're in, depending on what else is, available or growing around there, maybe they're feeding them kind of different things, but I don't know a direct answer.
Yeah, it's probably a hard question to answer, because it's probably, well, it depends. I was just curious because I think when upcycling or like the ugly food movement first came out, some of the initial pushback was, well, isn't that the kind of stuff that normally ends up going to food banks or goes into this thing or that thing or whatever? And it did have kind of a good use, and now you're diverting it from people who really needed that to a bunch of, rich uppity people who can afford to pay $20 for a fresh pressed juice or whatever, something like that. So there's like some criticism of that was kind of like a social impact kind of criticism, and I just was like translating that down to the animals too. Is like, well, they were getting this as a food source, and if we take it away, what happens then? So that's just kind of a larger question that I've heard people ask about upcycled in general. And I think the Upcycled Food Association is doing work to just try to like put a definition and some parameters around what counts as upcycling, and making sure that it is something that's moving up in use. And there's a great chart that I think you shared during a recent talk by the EPA that shows like the different uses of food, and at the very top is like the human consumption, and at the very bottom was probably landfill or something like that. But the idea of upcycling is moving it, something that would have been going to the landfill, up the chain. So even if it went from feeding animals up to humans, it's still having a better impact overall, because you're just moving it up that chain of the highest and best use, as the UFA says. So maybe we'll post a link to that chart too. We got lots of resources for the listeners on this call, or on this episode. So we should probably keep moving though. I think we're coming at like close to the end, but we still have a lot to get through. So just let's jump into like consumers. You've got a lot of different reasons for people to buy this, whether it's the carbon footprint, the just general upcycling climate change story, or switching to plant-based instead of animal-based products, etc. What are you finding so far in the communications that you have done? That what are consumers resonating most with?
Yeah, we, as with I think many startups, maybe in general, and also I think a lot of us in the upcycled food space continue to ask this question. We have done a few different, consumer insights kind of formal things. And what the hypothesis that Jarek and Matt really had early on basically was confirmed by some of those studies, which is that taste still is first. So for most consumers, it goes taste, nutrition, and then sustainability as far as like call outs or, things that matter. And so one of the reasons why, and if you ever talk to Matt, our co-founder, he from the very beginning was like, we're not going to make a super sustainable milk that doesn't fulfill the taste and functionality requirements and wants and needs of consumers, because it simply won't work. And so there's been a lot of amazing attention, just as much attention as put on upcycling. Like, my lens, my hat is like upcycling and impact all day, every day. But Matt's hat is like taste, flavor, and function all day, every day. And so if you talk to him, that's really, I mean, he also loves and is so passionate about the sustainability stuff, but his, he really has been non-negotiable about that. So many rounds of milk have already occurred, both before we launched and even since we occurred. There have been, improvements basically to our formulations that have been made. So as far as like, if you look at our barley milk bottle, our product on the shelf, the call outs are primarily about taste, how it tastes, our barista, how it froths, and then for all of our milk, how it performs in the kitchen, in recipes, and cooking and baking, and then, that you can just drink it by the glassful and it's delightful. One of the differentiators of our milk is that we offer complete protein. That's a whole nother, arm of sciencey stuff we could talk about for a really long time, but essentially by combining barley protein, which is a protein from grain, and pea protein, which is a protein from amino acids, or a protein from legumes, they have complementary amino acid profiles, which means that you get a complete protein by drinking our milk. There is no other plant-based milk at this point. Actually, maybe there's one or two other plant-based milks at this point that are providing complete protein. A lot of plant-based milks are providing some protein. It's still pretty low, but ours offers 3 to 5 grams. Our chocolate, 8 grams of complete protein per serving. So that, again, from Matt's, brain food scientist innovation, perspective was really like, it has to taste, it has to function just like dairy and or better, just like other plant-based milks and or better, or else we're like not putting it on the shelf. So from there, then there's a question of like, how are we sharing sustainability impacts in particular? And what seems to be, and is really exciting, but what seems to be really resonating with people are some of these call outs around the upcycled grain specifically. Like, by using upcycled grain, we're diverting, X amount of carbon emissions, saving X amount of water. And then the beautiful thing about the Refed Insights engine, which I'll just keep touting, yay for them, is it gives the conversions into like those of us, including myself, who are still learning about what those numbers really mean. So it gives the conversion to like, oh, well, that's the same amount of carbon emissions as would be generated if you drove, 5 cars 500 miles each, or if you drove, or if you charged like, 450,000 smartphones. These kind of things that in our mind then as consumers, we can be like, oh, wow, like drinking this instead of this saves like this amount of smartphone charges. Or, the water conversions are like Olympic-sized swimming pools and or showers. So one example is a 16-ounce, latte made with barista barley milk saves like 300 gallons of water. Which is just crazy. Just by, it's a 16-ounce, a 16-ounce bottle or a cup of coffee with 16 ounces of barley milk in it, and it has significant impact. Again, we're not saying that obviously there's water that goes into our manufacturing process. Obviously there's like water that the coffee shop is using. So it's not accounting for all of that. But just by using barley that wasn't taken from the farm, wasn't grown and had to be cultivated, et cetera, barley or spent grain that didn't end up in landfills, that didn't go to feed livestock, like all of those impacts kind of pulled into one thing. It saves a lot of water.
Yeah, and that's where like you said, the full life cycle analysis maybe would be able to give you the pure accurate picture, but like,
Yeah.
there's already going to be water used in making the espresso or whatever, so you can like eliminate that, because whether you're putting barley milk or oat milk in it, it's, there's still that part of the process. But then like, yeah, how much water does it take to make barley milk versus coconut milk versus oat milk versus whatever? Like getting deep into some of those analysis I think would be interesting. But yeah, to your point, I think one thing that people who don't have to do a lot of sustainability communications don't understand is that you can't just be like, we saved 800 tons of carbon or whatever, because the average person, even people in sustainability, are going to be like, well, how is that good? Like, is that bad? I don't really know. And even like when you say 300 gallons, because this is something we've been working on with Regrain too, is similar product, similar impact. And we've been thinking, well, does anyone even know what 300 gallons looks like? So then we're even breaking that down further and saying, what does 300 gallons mean? Like, how many showers is that? Or how much drinking water is that? Or, whatever, trying to find some sort of way that people can wrap their mind around it. Like you're saying, the cell phone charges, like maybe that's something more tangible for people, where they can literally say, oh, by drinking this latte, I just offset my cell phone charging for a year, or something very tangible to them. But as soon as you scale it to like, that's the equivalent of an entire country's cell phone usage, then it just gets like more and more abstract in their mind, and they have a hard time wrapping their mind around it. And it maybe sometimes sounds impressive, like 300 gallons is a bigger number than like 12 showers or, whatever. I can't remember what that number is. But it's harder to wrap your mind around at the same time. So I don't know. Have you found any strategies for what works best for you in trying to break that stuff down into consumer friendly terms?
I think it's the similar exercise to what you were just saying, which is like, what are those conversions that actually mean something to people? And then simultaneously, parallel to that, I think that there is something to be said about, what is now, I mean, it's not new, but it's coming more and more forward, as like the carbon literacy movement, which is like, what if as a culture we got to a place someday where those carbon footprints that are on the front of pack, actually, like, we actually do know what they mean, and we can very quickly look at 2 or 3 options on a shelf and be like, oh, from a carbon perspective, that one's better, and I know that, very in not just like a numbers kind of way, but in like some slightly more holistic or like robust kind of way. And therefore, and then so there's like the literacy, us understanding, and then there's some other like tipping point maybe where it's like enough people are actually making decisions based on that, and that will be truly, transformative for the food system, transformative for potentially, climate solutions as well, is if there truly are enough people who see those things, understand on some level what they mean, and then make different purchasing decisions because of it. So
yeah, that would be nice. I'm just like my pessimistic side is like, how long have nutrition labels been on the back of food, and 99% of people have no idea what they mean? Like, so it's just like, that would be nice, but that seems like a long road. So I agree that literacy across all sorts of things about like, what does organic mean, or like, what is a carbon footprint, or even I was just having a call this morning about probiotics, and there's just that one thing. There's so much you have to understand to really know what this strain of probiotic is doing for your body, and what claims you can make based on different research. And it's just, you almost have to have a PhD to know really what this probiotic that you're buying on the shelf is doing, right? And so there just has to be, regulations around what you can and can't say, and the industry has to get good at converting that into consumer friendly stuff, because I would love it if all consumers were literate on social and environmental and economic kind of terms, but they're a little bit more hooked on TikTok than they are on sustainability reports. so, so it might be a long road there.
Yeah, I
With
think
that
of,
said,
oh yeah, go
oh,
ahead.
go ahead.
I was just going to say, of everyone that I've met, in the upcycled food world, I think everyone's so committed because there is the potential for upcycling to just become like one of these nutrition based or like food based
Yeah.
buzzwords, the way that probiotics have become, where it's like now like anything with probiotics in it means it's good, or like anything
Yeah.
with ashwagandha in it means it's good. It's like, but people don't even know, like you're saying, like what it is, what it does for you, like et cetera, et cetera. So
I don't know why it's good, but I think it's good.
I don't know why it's good. It just is. So I think, yeah, that real spirit of education is so alive in the upcycling movement, where it's like it may or may not become a sort of buzzword, and maybe that would help our cause on some level. But like this real commitment to like let's really share with people. As a brand, it's even that way, which is like we're committed to educating people about upcycling, because it's at the heart of our mission, and that's a bit of a long road, potentially, but it's worth it. So
But I feel like that's much more feasible. Like you said, you're just relying on something simpler. Like you don't have to teach them what upcycling is or how much carbon it offsets or how much food waste it diverts. But if they just know that if they see that up with the little leaf on a box that it's good for you, and that's like when we were designing that certification mark, we wanted to intentionally make it as simple as possible with the word big, positive word up, and then like that green leaf, because people know that green leaf means sustainable or impactful in some way. And like if that's all we communicate with that mark, that's a win, right? And then hopefully they see that mark enough that they start asking themselves, okay, well, what exactly does it mean to be upcycled, or what is that impact? Then they can go find that information. But until we get them to care, by wanting to seek out that more impactful thing, it's going to be a long road for education. But yeah, I like what you're saying there, that I think that's one of the benefits of the Upcycled Food Association and all the brands like yours involved in it, is that you can use all of your marketing power together to try to speed up the consumer awareness that upcycled is good.
yeah.
So I was going to ask, I know we're more than out of time probably, but just to wrap up, I'm just curious, do you have, you've been on this journey for a little while now, do you have some advice for other brands trying to figure out how to assess their impact and communicate it in a way that's good for consumers?
Mm. Maybe. um, this isn't yet. Maybe there's two pieces. Well, one is, so one of the things that we're super lucky and blessed with inside of Take Two is we have two co-founders as well as a larger leadership team who are very, very much aligned with impact and sustainability related, actions, practices, decisions, etc. So if you're a founder out there who's listening, like, don't give your sustainability people crap for bringing these like innovative things to the table. I think that's a question that I get a lot, is like, is it hard to convince my team or our team that these are good ideas? Like we're headed into a year where we're gonna start our plastic offsetting. We're gonna start carbon offsetting. Like they're like, oh, is it hard for you to get like approvals for that? And I'm like, no, it's not hard. At this point, knock on wood, like our whole team is on board. So I just have that like hope or wish or prayer for companies out there to like let this work become what's possible. Like, can we really align around these values, these practices, these ways of creating impact that are just as important as obviously needing to sell milk, generate revenue, and generate profits. But can we hold all of that together? And then for other impact brands specifically, I think creating a strategy, if you're a sustainability person or even a marketing person, but from a sustainability perspective, creating a strategy for kind of what we talked about earlier. What are you going to assess? At what level? And then how are you going to communicate that, and working with your marketing people to kind of make plans for that. Because I think for us, that has been, again, we've done some of it well, and there's other areas where it was the BARD example is a great one where we were like, oh, we can't publish this, which is okay. We'll use it to do better internally. But then what's the next step for us so that we can, if we want to someday, put our carbon footprint on pack? So just creating those strategies or those priorities for what really matters, and then assessing and then making improvements. And then if you want to share out, then sharing out.
Yeah, I love that. It's a good kind of like baby step method, because once you have the framework, you can just decide where to start, right? Like you've got your ingredient, product, and company kind of angles that you look at it from, but you don't have to do it all at once. You can just start from the ingredient, or start from the product, or start with the company, and then know that you've got goals to expand from there. So that's good advice. And then also, I hear that all the time, is like, how do I convince my client, or how do I convince my boss, or how do I convince whomever to kind of go with some of these sustainability initiatives? And my advice back to them is usually, well, communicate it in a way that's compelling to the person you're trying to convince. So if you're talking to the CFO who's like, we can't spend money on that, if you bring them a good financial case for doing it, like you're probably going to save money, or actually will make a lot more money because people want this, or something like that. Or if you're communicating it to your CEO or chief of product or whatever, that's like, well, it's got to be good quality, it's got to taste good or whatever. And if you can bring them data that or samples of the product or whatever, and show them that it's still going to meet all their criteria and have these extra benefits, well, you're much more likely to convince them. So instead of going in telling them like, but I want this because it's good for whatever, like go in and tell them why it's good for them, and you'll have much more success in convincing the upper management.
Yes, that's also great.
Cool.
Great advice.
Well, this is a wonderful chat. We could geek out for hours more, I'm sure, but just want to say heartfelt thank you for doing what you do, and for creating a delicious product that I'm excited to get my hands on and try out. And
I was going to say in the beginning, how have you not tasted, how have I A, not sent you samples, or B, you have like, I guess not encountered it in the world yet, but like, yes, I got to get you samples. It's got to be before Expo, so that's on my list.
Nice. Yeah, I would love that. But yeah, I moved to a much smaller city during the pandemic, to Olympia instead of Seattle, so my access to like a lot of these products that I usually can easily pick up in Seattle has become much more difficult. So now I have to like either buy it online or go like an hour away to a different grocery store. So it's been a bit of a challenge that I'm working on. But yeah, that would be wonderful. But anyway, excited to try it. Sounds delicious. And I appreciate what you're doing, and all that you personally are doing, but all that Take Two is doing to help combat climate change and make better products so we can make a better future. So thanks for taking some time out to share that story with us.
Thanks for connecting so many amazing brands through your work too, Gage. It's amazing.
Yeah, I love it. Thanks. Cheers. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Bree or Take Two, go to take2foods.com. Business can be a powerful force for good. Is your brand living up to its full potential? Go to evolvecpg.com to learn about our new impact workshop, Exponential Good. Over 6 weeks, we'll be thinking bigger, getting relevant, spreading throughout, going exponential, working backwards, and making it real so you can walk away with a clear vision and a detailed action plan for scaling your brand's positive impact exponentially. Review and share it with your colleagues. As an ever-evolving show, we also love feedback, so send us your thoughts or ideas for who we should talk to next to evolve@modernspecies.com.